We are in the second part of the story about the man that was born blind in John chapter 9. I decided to break it up into two parts because it's long. And those of you who have been studying the Bible with me know one of the first things you do when you look at a passage is to see how much ink the author gives to a story. And in doing so, you're going to see how important that story is to the author. Because it wasn't a situation where they could go back through and edit. It wasn't a situation where they could just email it. They had parchment, they had ink, and there was only so much room on that parchment to use. So they talked about what was important to them. And when they found something that was important, they used a lot of ink. And in John chapters 8 and 9, you're in the same situation. It means a lot to John. In this story in chapter 9, where it starts out in verse 1, we're going to find out later is on a Sabbath. And Jesus is there in Jerusalem. They've tried to kill him. They tried to stone him, but he escaped the situation where they were in the temple. And he's wandering around Jerusalem and he finds this man that was born blind. And like we talked about last week, the man didn't ask Jesus to heal him. But Jesus was answering a question about a religious debate. Who sinned that this man was born blind? He or his parents? And we noticed that were the only two options. And Jesus said, no, there's a third option. Neither one. This has nothing to do with somebody sinning. But this is one of those things that was just accepted at the time. You know, you have some foundational beliefs, some worldview that you may never have questioned. You might have got it from your parents, your grandparents, your teachers, somewhere, some basic fundamental principles that you maybe never pulled out and looked at and said, is that really true? One of them was, for this generation, if somebody had a physical problem, like being blind, that was a punishment for sin. So then the interesting debate is, well then who sinned if a man was born blind? Was it his parents or was it him? And that'd be hard because he was born blind. He had to do it in the womb. We talked about that last week. Jesus said neither. That's a bad principle. That's a bad precept. That's a bad fundamental belief. It doesn't apply here. So he makes some mud. He spits on the ground and makes some mud, puts it on the guy's eye, and tells him to go to a place called, well, the word means Siloam, and wash it off. And the guy washed it off and he could see, and now there's this big ruckus about whether he really is the guy or not. And now I'm going to get my glasses because this is a long passage. So we're going to pick up this story in verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been born blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he'd received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. Okay, why did they bring this guy to the Pharisees? Why did this man rank this special assembly with the Pharisees, the religious leaders, the people who everybody looked up to? Well, because this was a big miracle. We talked about that last week. And most of your other authors, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, would left it at a miracle. It was an amazing miracle. But John's going to do something else with the story. And he's going to tell what the religious leaders did with it. They brought him to them because now there's this quandary. Oh man. So if we still hold on to the sin principle, the reason he was born blind because of sin, then in order for him to be healed, he would have to have his sin taken away. Who can do that? Oh, God. This is the problem. So, let's bring it to the religious leaders and let them work it out. Let's look into this. What exactly happened? Well, he made some mud, sent me down, I washed, and I was healed. Now I can see. Got to be something wrong with this story. First thing I see is wrong is it was done on the Sabbath, and now I would consider that work, and therefore we can just kind of count off the whole thing. It says here, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner do such miraculous signs? So they were divided. Don't you love to see religious leaders debate amongst themselves? Have you ever been part of that? Have you ever seen religious people debate? It's not very pretty. And they're usually not very nice to each other. And it's really sad because it brings out their sinful nature. Right? So when we got this divided house, some say, well, obviously it's not from God, we'll just close the book there. Others said, wait a minute, we got a miracle. This man was born blind and now he sees. Now, how can you just pass off that miracle? All right, we're going to get to the bottom of this. Finally, they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. And the man replied, he is a prophet. This is kind of a cool thing. Okay? They talk to the guy and they're going to pass it off to him. All right, what is your view of the man? Now, this man has not been trained religiously, has he? This man cannot even read Scripture. You know how I know that? Because he was born blind. Okay? And maybe he went to the synagogue, but the truth is they probably didn't encourage him to go to the synagogue because there was something tainted about this man. But they asked his opinion anyway, and the guy says, I think he speaks the words of God. I think he's a prophet. Well, okay, well that didn't get him where they wanted to go. So what are we going to do now? He says, the Jews still did not believe that he had been born blind and received his sight until he sent for the man's parents. I mean, that's the easiest thing, right? This really wasn't a miracle. This guy was never born blind. Well, let's send for the parents. Okay? He says, is this your son, they ask. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see? We know he is our son, the parents answered, and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He will speak for himself. And then John tells us, his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. That is why his parents said, he is of age, ask him. It would have been so cool for them if they would have said, you know, we might have really made a mistake. Maybe he just needed glasses. No, they had a child who was born blind. You can imagine the kind of hardships that was on the family with a child that was born blind. And now you know what his job is? Now that he was blind all those years and he's of age? He was a beggar. What else could he do? He stood out and gave people a chance to gain spiritual points by saying, alms. Alms for the blind. The parents were not going to get caught in this. Why? They didn't want to lose their pew at church. Yeah. They were real comfortable in their pew. Sat there every Saturday. People knew this is their pew. You don't sit there. Now, they didn't have pews. They didn't have church. They had a synagogue. But they went every Saturday, right? And these people were afraid to be kicked out of the synagogue by acknowledging that this amazing miracle had happened to their son. Do you think the parents would be ecstatic? You think that they would be really, 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 really grateful to Jesus, right? No, they were good religious people. They went to synagogue every Sunday, or Saturday. And they didn't want to mess that up. They sure didn't want to get involved with a debate with the Jewish religious leaders, and they sure didn't want them to look down on them, so they just passed the whole thing off. We know he was born, he was our son, we know he was born blind. Other than that, we don't know, ask him.